You're listening to Fellow Travellers with East of Moon. Welcome to Fellow Travellers, a podcast from East of Moon. We are an organisation that operates in the form of a laboratory for community-centred innovation. As part of our work, we study, experiment with and develop the ways in which communities create together. My name is Josie-Ann Gatens, and in this first episode I spoke with author, editor and anthropologist Christopher Marcatili, delving into the value of research and the potential for experimental methods of data gathering to redefine the boundaries between observer and participant. Welcome, Christopher.
Thank you very much for having me.
It's so wonderful to have you here. Maybe you would start by just telling us a little bit about who you are and what you do and how you ended up in Iceland doing the research that you're doing.
Sure. So my name is Christopher Marcatili. I'm a PhD student at the Australian National University. I'm studying anthropology, and I chose Iceland as my field site to, look at creative writing practices and processes and how these intersect and overlap with social and cultural change. I kind of came into this over many years, actually. I did my undergrad in anthropology back in 2006 or 7, I think, and made friends with one of the lecturers there, Yasmin Musharbash. And over many years, I worked for her as a research assistant, and we always had chats over wine and Christmas parties and so on about what I would eventually want to do if I was to ever do my PhD. And I never was really sure. And I, in the interim, ended up doing a Master's of Creative Writing at the University of Technology in Sydney and had an amazing time. And since then have worked largely as a professional copy editor and working in operations for not-for-profit organizations and doing this whole other life, but always having this kind of seed of anthropology as being a really interesting way of looking at the world, and also a passion for writing and creativity that I wanted to explore. And I really wanted to bring those things, the two things, into conversation with each other, but I wasn't really sure if that was possible. And when I did my undergrad, it really felt like anthropology was this very particular thing. You would go off to Papua New Guinea or to Africa or somewhere like this to study people far away and very different. And actually, there's so much more potential in that field to do many more, pretty much anything you want, because it's the study of humans, and we're everywhere, and we're doing all sorts of strange and wonderful things. And so when I spoke with Yasmin about bringing these two things into conversation, she was very supportive. And encouraged me to think about how I would do that and where I would do that. And then I'd gone to Iceland on a holiday once, I think back in 2014, with a friend, and just loved it so much and kind of always wanted to return. And then when it came to thinking about actually doing the PhD and making a decision about where I would go, there were a few places I was considering, but Iceland had this reputation for being a literary place and a place with a long history of storytelling. There were narratives or a reputation for it having so many people who are writing books here that made me curious. The figure of something like 10% of Icelanders will write a book was one that I came across and was often repeated in lots of places. And so I was kind of curious about why that would be the case, that this narrative would exist. A lot of the literature I was looking at about Iceland, recent literature, was about the economic crash. And so I wanted to do something that wasn't that was maybe post that. And so a lot of the kind of factors aligned really strongly. And then I was really fortunate to find at Iceland University Professor Kristin Lofsdottir, another anthropologist, and she was super supportive of me coming here and helping me get my, status as a visiting scholar. So I was able to do a year-long field work here. So I've been here for a year talking to authors and writers and other creatives just about sort of life here and how things have been and how things have been changing. And yeah, a lot of them I've been speaking with migrant authors and migrant creatives, and being here at Hapna House has really opened up the sort of the doors of opportunity for me to kind of meet a whole range of different people, both Icelandic born and migrants, and across many different creative disciplines, which has just kind of made my creative life, but also my research life kind of explode in all sorts of different directions. So it's been a really interesting and eye-opening experience for the last year.
Can you tell me a little bit more about some of the ways that your research or your practice has been different from how you expected? Did you expect to be focusing so much on kind of multilingual or migrant voices when you initially came? I think I'm asking that in part because there is this identity of Iceland outside of the country as being quite purely Icelandic, and a lot of the creative industry being generated from Icelanders, or this kind of more pure idea of an Icelander. And yeah, I'm just interested, especially as you mentioned, you're based in Hafna House, where East of Moon is also based, which is this creative hub within the city centre of Reykjavik. And it in and of itself is an incredibly multilingual place and features, there's Icelandic people, native Icelanders who live and work here, but there's also people from all over the globe. And sometimes I even wonder if we should have like our version of like Hafna House English should be studied for how it's come about, because it's so reflective of a melting pot of cultures here. But yeah, from your kind of original intentions and what you thought you'd be looking at, how did that shift and change when you arrived in Iceland?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think my initial, well, I should say it's common in anthropology to be led by your experiences in the field. A lot of scientists and social scientists will formulate an idea about what they want to do, and then they'll go and either prove themselves right or wrong, essentially. Anthropologists tend to approach it differently. They tend to want to be led by the experiences that they have. So I kind of came with a bit of an open mind, although of course you always have some assumptions. So I was assuming that most of the work and time that I would be spending would be with Icelandic-born authors and talking with them about how things like tourism or maybe migration was impacting like change in society more broadly. And I did have many conversations like that with many Icelandic authors, but perhaps not surprisingly, on reflection, I didn't have the same opportunities to connect with them as I had with other, with migrant communities here. And at first this kind of concerned me because I had this image of what I was supposed to be doing, and I was worried that I wasn't working hard enough to kind of make my way into the sort of inner sanctum of what's going on or something like this. And one of my supervisors said to me that actually it makes complete sense that I would connect more with migrant authors here because I myself am a migrant author while I'm here. So I did not expect there to be such a flourishing community of migrant authors here. I was kind of quite surprised at first and I felt like I'd come at just the right moment in a way, because a few key things had been happening over the last couple of years since the 10 years that I'd been here previously as a visitor that were really, really interesting to me, and that changed quite significantly what I was doing. So I thought I would be spending a lot of time at book launches and at writers, conferences, and maybe going into writers' studios. Or one thing that I had in mind, which we have in Australia that doesn't really exist here, are things like writers' centres. Mm-hmm. There's the Grundelshus here in downtown Reykjavik that has office space for a handful of writers, and I think used to do writers' events. But writers' centres that I'm sort of more familiar with back home are very open to many members, people coming and going. There are always events happening at them, and I thought those would be the types of places that I'd be spending my time. They just don't really exist here in the same way that they exist elsewhere, I guess. So at first I was a little concerned, and then I discovered things like Osprasan Journal, which is a journal that publishes in any language. It publishes not quite once a year. It's been running since 2016. I think it was the first publication in Iceland that really embraced sort of multilingual or multivocal publishing. And I was very fortunate to meet some of the board and editors of the journal, and then have been volunteering on the editorial board. That only, as I mentioned, started in 2016. There's also the Reykjavik Poetics event series that I've been a producer for and helping out with since I arrived. Again, multivocal, multilingual event series that runs every month. So I found this kind of emergent community of, I would say, largely migrant authors, but not solely. I think in both of these places you have also Icelandic authors involved in running or participating. So the mentality is very much about trying to be inclusive and open to everyone. This was very exciting to me because it seemed like something that was emerging out of the processes of social and cultural change that I was interested in. So I wasn't just talking to people about their opinions of what was going on. I was also talking to people about who were actually living this and kind of, in some ways, making some of the change happen. Mm-hmm. So that's part of it. I think also what has been sort of unexpected has emerged from my time at Hafna House, where you have so many people doing so many different things, and there's so many opportunities to get involved. And so I always wanted there to be a kind of creative component to my time here in the field in Iceland, but I was never quite sure what that would be. And it emerged quite naturally that the Hafna Zine was an opportunity for me to kind of both get involved in the community here and give something to the community when I was getting so much from it. But it also gave me the skills and the confidence to do my own and work with writers here to kind of come together and create our own projects, a little zine that we launched last year. And yeah, again, I don't think I would have known where to start without the opportunities that were here and the people that I met. There were many times when I thought about not doing that because I had sort of self-doubts about it and I wasn't sure if people would be interested. And so, there was a lot of encouragement from people here that helped that come to fruition, not to mention the skills, and the support that I was able to get access to. So I would say it was unexpected, or it wasn't totally unexpected that there would be a creative element to it, but really being here at Hafna House gave me the structure and foundations that were really essential to bringing that about.
I want to come back to the zine that you yourself produced as part of your PhD in a little bit, but I want to take you up on this theme in terms of anthropology itself, this new way of researching. And I say new, I know it's new in the grand scheme of things, where, as you said before, there was this relationship with researchers and subjects for a long time that there was an other and they were quite removed. And this has been the traditional model of research, not just for anthropology, but for a lot of scientific study for a very long time. It's always had a large emphasis on not influencing results, not changing things, which I think has become more and more established as a false narrative for many fields of science, particularly any kind of social science. The idea that even by just observing something changes is more and more established as a concept. And from what I can see, anthropology is kind of leading the way in terms of this way of thinking about research as also being involved, and that the change is understood and expected, and it is kind of it's written into the idea of this kind of research. Can you tell me a little bit more about this kind of model of conducting research and what value it has, and what some of the pitfalls might be from being perhaps too close to or too involved in the subject that you're trying to look at?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think anthropology due to its legacy and history, as often it's called the handmaiden of colonialism, because the role that anthropologists played in helping colonial governments and bodies kind of control, the people who are being colonized. This has led to a lot of self-reflection and a critique of the discipline from within, which has led to a lot of questioning of both, yes, its history, the way that it's conducted, and an opening up, I think, of many of these things. So, doing anthropology at home became sort of acceptable as a model. I did in my undergrad, I looked at activist anthropology. That's anthropology that was very intentionally working with often indigenous groups and organizations and actually asking them what outcomes and essentially what outcomes they wanted from the research, so that it could be led by those community organizations rather than a research relationship being purely extractive of knowledge or resources or whatever. So there are loads of different models now and attempts to decolonize the discipline, and I think you're right, it's broadening out into other disciplines as well. I'm really excited by as I sort of mentioned, the increase in acceptance of alternative ways of doing anthropology, of communicating anthropology creatively, and slowly, I think, breaking down the barriers between the academic worlds and the community at large. And for me, this is a really big part of what I'm interested in, because I think that is still a huge challenge that we face as academics, making our research sort of broadly useful. I don't think we should always measure the value of research by its usefulness per se, because you never know what's going to eventuate into something that's kind of quote unquote useful or profitable or whatever. But I think the way that the industry or these kind of disciplines have developed, they're very much about retaining knowledge and maintaining a distance between practitioners of this knowledge gathering and other people, and that strikes me as really counterintuitive. So creative methods are really helpful, I think, in bringing new people in engaging in different types of conversation, in disseminating knowledge in interesting ways. This is kind of what I'm sort of interested in mostly, is how things like a zine, for instance, or a novel or a piece of artwork or a podcast or a piece of music or whatever can be used to express ideas that otherwise might not be very engaging for an audience if it's expressed kind of purely academically. I think as well, what we're seeing more of is accountability in the disciplines like anthropology. It was once the case that the people that we would study, so to speak, were, from far-flung places. They probably didn't speak English and so on. And so you could kind of get away with writing whatever you wanted without any real accountability. And it's no longer the case that, often... I was just talking the other day with an anthropologist who was interviewing someone that she had previously been teaching in so she had been teaching them here, but they're from Africa. And then when she went to Africa to do some interviews for some fieldwork, they were like, "Oh, do you remember me? I was in your class." And so these barriers that once existed don't exist anymore, really, and that makes for much more accountable, anthropology and study. Analysis and so on. And I think this is a good thing because, for instance, when I came to Hupna House and I was talking to the hosts here, I wanted to be, and in fact, I think I did a Tuesday talk early on.
Yes, I remember that one, yes.
And I wanted to sort of be upfront that I was here kind of interested in the types of things that I'm talking about. And that, I thought that Hupna House was a perfect place for me to kind of gain some of the insights that I was interested in gaining, but also that I wanted to give back in certain ways, both through my volunteering to do things for different, groups or whatever, but also to make the data or knowledge available to people who are here who are interested. So, for instance, I was sort of doing a little mapping project recently where I was interviewing people about creative spaces, and my intention is to make that data available to Hapna House as well. So, it makes it much more transparent research processes.
This mapping that you're talking about has been. I'm very interested in this, and I think it's, again, speaks to what you were just saying about the kind of value of this kind of research. And again, that's a tricky word, value, as you've pointed out. That are we talking about financial value or institutional knowledge, or what is deemed useful and when and by whom? But you have been doing this project where you've been looking at, as well as creative people and creative practice, as creative spaces and how these things intersect. Can you tell me a little bit about that research, specifically how you got involved in doing it and what has been some of the outcomes of that so far? What have you been learning?
Yeah. When I was kind of considering my research broadly, I was interested in the idea of creative spaces, partly because I think we have this idea of a kind of creative practitioner who works maybe solo and is just doing their thing in their office or in their attic or wherever. And I was interested in all the points at which a creative process is actually socially connected. And so, for instance, a creative will go through some training and will be maybe in a class and getting ideas from their lecturer or whoever, their teacher, through to engaging with an audience. And so I was kind of interested in the point where the creativity actually takes place, where the person is actually doing the work. And often this is a solo project, like literally someone is on their own in a room. They want silence. They want no distractions. But of course, there's only so much time you can work like that. And so I was interested in how a creative space, we conceive of this as a material thing. It's a room with objects in it, but actually it's also a socially constructed space where it has a particular value to people. It has a particular kind of resonance for them individually, but also probably, or at least in a space like Hapna House, has all these connections with other people that are also really valuable for that person's kind of creativity. So, for instance, being able to borrow equipment from someone in the room next door, or asking their advice on how to do this or that technique that they've never tried before, or just being able to sit with them in the lunchroom and chat about something completely separate from their creative practice, but which is of interest to them and is like fun and interesting, through to other opportunities that might come about here, like workshops or social events or whatever. So all of this is often invisible and really hard to kind of see or measure. And so it's hard to communicate why spaces like this are really important.
And also how those spaces and those tangible things are connected with the intangible. So like you say about these resources, like if you have a neighbor who can lend you something, but that access to that equipment is inherently based on not just that person is proximate to you, but that you have a social connection with that person.
Absolutely. And that's a positive one, and there's a trusting one, and so on and so forth, and all these kind of packaged aspects that make that exchange, happen. And so, yeah, it's often these things are quite very difficult to kind of see, let alone to measure and to demonstrate to outsiders. I say that whatever that might mean, people maybe in governments or people in the community at large, why something like Hapna House or other sort of spaces like this are really important, not just for the individuals, but sort of for the kind of creative ecology at large.
I like that phrase.
Yeah,
it's really good.
I came up with that on the spot.
Creative ecology. I'm going to definitely steal that one.
Great. I think, data collection in sort of more scientific, quote unquote, methods can be very useful at many things. But one thing that anthropology does really well is try to kind of get past quantitative sort of look at things, the kind of numbers, and look at the lived experience of whatever phenomenon. So here we're looking at the lived experience of what it's like to be in a creative community like this, and hopefully be able to communicate that to others, so that the value is not just measured in numbers or in dollars or whatever, but actually also these kinds of the value of these relationships that exist and the things that emerge out of them that otherwise couldn't exist.
In terms of this research, and you're kind of being a bit broad about who you might want to consume the data, quantitative, qualitative, otherwise. To pin you down on that a little bit, like, where do you think this can go? Would you like it to affect change? Who would you like to be involved in this conversation who's not already in it, as someone who is in the research themselves and talking to creatives? And so there's a number of known members in this discussion, but who's missing and who could learn from this material?
I think first and foremost, as I'm coming from a research and academic kind of perspective, I think there's still a lot of learning to be done in that field. Like not just anthropologists, but researchers in general tend to be a bit wary of or uncertain about how to work and collaborate with creative communities. I think there's huge potential, and I was aware of projects here bringing together scientists and creatives at various points, for example. And I think these are really fruitful conversations that need to happen. So the sciences and the academic sector, I think, is one sector that needs to kind of realize that there's a lot of potential in working alongside creatives, that this isn't just about finding interesting ways of disseminating the knowledge that scientists or academics produce, but actually in the collaboration generate new knowledge in interesting and important ways, and challenge maybe assumptions about, all sorts of things that are inherent in the ways that this research is done. I think as well, it would be great if, coming from sort of an advocacy and not-for-profit background, I always like to think that it would be great if research could affect change from a top-down level as well. We would love to see more spaces like this exist, I think, here in Reykjavik, but also more broadly. I think Hafna House is unique for a lot of reasons, and it's always going to be unique, but it would be great if it was less unique. It would be great if there were more Hafna Houses around, so...
Not sure what the plural of Hafna House should be. Hafnar Hoisi, I don't know.
We can think about that one, But yeah, larger creative communities that are affordable, that are kind of accessible, that are kind of, collaboratively run and, engaged with the community. I think there's so much that the model here is working well. And I've worked in a lot of co-working spaces, creative co-working spaces before, some of which have been great and some of which have been kind of average. But there is something special about the way that this one is working. So yeah, I think government, academia and the sciences, these are kind of definitely people who I would hope to kind of bring into the conversation. And then, big picture, what I would also really love is to make, as I was saying, to make research more accessible for an audience. And that audience is a general audience. So there's also the general public that often is not interested in the anthropological findings, even though in my view they're really interesting. And it's a failing on our part to kind of not make them interesting enough, I think.
Well, you have done some very interesting things with your research here, and I want to come now to the zines.
Sure.
Which again, in an effort to be really transparent, I'm also been involved in to some extent with the Hafna House zine.
Yes.
And like you say about Hafna House, about this creative hub, it's always been this unexpected miracle of creativity, I think, where things just happen to you and collaborations just kind of explode into being from nothing. And the zine for me has really been that, and I think for you as well, it's been a really wonderful way in which this community has been able to express itself to itself, but also has had some reach outside of the co-working community through the physical embodiment of the zines, which were available to people outside of the house, but also there's now been, you've been involved in a zine fair and small kind of conference, and then of course you created your own zine which was connected to your research. So yeah, maybe just tell me a little bit more about zine writing and your experience of getting involved in this and how this worked within both your creative and your academic practice.
Yeah. I think before I came, I was aware of zines. I'd been to a zine fair, I think, or two back in the 2000s, maybe.
When they were really hip.
Exactly. But I was talking about this with someone recently. They kind of had an aesthetic or it was always my arts friends who were doing zines, and I didn't really see myself as part of that community, and I didn't really think about it as something that I would pursue creatively myself or academically. And then before I came here, I was thinking about ways that I could bring some kind of creative practice into the research. And so I wanted it to be a collaborative project of some kind. And I thought maybe it would be an anthology of short stories or something like this. But I was kind of thinking it could be a zine. And then when I got here, I found that there was actually the first zine of the series that we did last year had just come out, I think. And so I got myself a copy. And I was like, oh, wow, this is really cool and interesting. And I sort of became, I think, by issue 2, I had submitted a piece of writing. So I was a contributor. And then I think for the 3rd issue, I was helping to fold and all this kind of stuff. And so slowly...
That's how it happens here. It just grows and grows on you. Yeah, absolutely.
Pulls you in. But very happily so. And there are many ways of doing a zine. I think, there are probably people who can better explain what zines are, but I guess in a nutshell, it's sort of a DIY publishing method where you can make it as kind of flashy or as grungy as you want. It can include writing, images, all sorts of stuff, anything really. And so what struck me about the way that it was being done here was really collaborative. Like the themes were being decided by the community. Anyone could submit, anyone could be involved. And there was a lot of work and creativity that went into and care that went into each and every issue. And I liked that idea of it being open to anyone. And it resonated a lot also with what I was doing with Ospresan and with Reykjavik Poetics, because the spirit of breaking down the barriers or getting rid of the gatekeepers really was kind of a theme through each of these projects. It was really trying to just make these projects as inclusive as possible. And so I thought this was really interesting and really cool. And it was what I was hoping to accomplish with my creative work, because I kind of wanted to see, the conception that I had was I wanted to see the creative process from the inside, other people's creative processes from the inside. And so I thought collaborating with them and working with them closely on their work would be the best way of doing that, rather than just asking them about it. And so the idea of the zine that I did, which is Iceland in other words, I called it a zine of ethnographic fiction. This basically started with me reaching out to a bunch of people that I had been meeting and talking to, and asking if they would submit a story that would capture some sense of what it's like to live in Iceland today. They could do this in whatever way that they thought was appropriate. And so I got quite a few different types of things. I got, short stories, but I also got poetry, an illustration, an interactive story that was online. Yeah, and it was a really interesting project, and I think the reason why it's one of the reasons why it's really valuable as an academic as well as a creative. One, you bring multiple people into the process, so you automatically, for instance, as an anthropologist, have opportunities to have natural conversations with people about something like, well, in my case, it was about living in Iceland, but if you were doing a zine about something else, you could be having conversations about that. But also, again, you're breaking down this idea of the outside researcher coming in and dictating what's important or how we should do things, and having that collaborative mindset about, what are we going to produce? And because a zine is such a versatile format, it really can become anything that people want it to be. And so, yeah, I think it becomes such a flexible tool, really, to kind of take your research in all sorts of directions. And those directions might be led by you as a researcher, but they might also be led by kind of what people on the ground are actually interested in talking about or reading or producing, which makes it, I think, kind of an ethically kind of minded approach, but also really interesting and creative and produces unexpected findings. So it kind of works on multiple levels.
I'm interested also in terms of this intersection between your creative practice and your research work. Your creative practice, of course, is not just writing in and of itself, but fictional writing.
Mm-hmm.
I'm thinking about this from the context of the zine, which includes a piece of writing that I'm quite interested in terms of how much it relates to real or imagined experiences,
Mm-hmm.
but also in terms of the way that you have begun to express some of your research, which is through creating personas.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell me a bit about, you can start with whichever one you want, but about both of those things and how, this intersection between being a fiction author and writing your research up, how that's intersecting and how you're finding a way to connect the two of those?
Yeah. So the personas method is one that I'm trying out. I've tried it out now in 2 articles or chapters that I wrote. And basically, in a nutshell, the idea is, so often with anthropology or with other forms of research, interview-based research, you want to try to protect the identity of the person who's speaking with you. This is not always the case. Sometimes I'm working with authors, and many of them are quite happy to put their name to what they've said because they're used to talking with interviewers and so on. But sometimes some of the conversations can touch on matters that are a bit more sensitive, or, for whatever reason, you might not want to just name people. And so rather than just use a pseudonym, which a lot of people would generally do, where they just come up with a fake name for someone, I tried this other method where I basically, if I saw thematic, phrases or quotes coming out of multiple people, I would combine them into a persona that was invented. And the reason was because Iceland is a small place and Reykjavik is a small city, and the writing community is an even smaller subset of that. And so the notion that you could actually, you can never really guarantee anonymity, but that you could kind of mask these identities was really tricky. And so I thought this might be an interesting way of bringing my own creative practice slightly into the academic writing that I'm doing. And this was sort of a suggestion from one of my supervisors to try this out. I'm not sure that it works because it is a small place, and because, as I mentioned, there's no separation between an anthropologist and the subject, so to speak, in quotes, and an audience. All of these things are kind of mixed in together. So people may not necessarily know who said what, but they might have an idea. And even if that idea is wrong, that has certain ethical implications as a researcher.
Absolutely. I mean, even if that idea is wrong, that can even be more dangerous in some ways.
Indeed. Yeah, exactly. So that's something that I'm thinking through, and I'm still kind of grappling with that as a methodological approach. So, we'll see how that sort of goes. The other part of the question about using creative writing to reflect on my experiences as a researcher. So in my short story in the zine, Survival Tips, I had a few people assume that it was real. So in the story, there's a person who's going to a choir, who wants to join a choir, and they end up being rejected. And instead of attending the choir, they sort of sit in the kitchenette of the community hall and sing along at a distance. But also, they're living with an older woman, and there are these interactions. And I would say none of it is real. None of it actually happened. But it's a creative interpretation of things that did actually happen. So, I mean, I did live with a woman, an older woman, and the kind of a setup of the scene of that story is kind of real in that sense. But she never said those things to me that I said that she said, like that the character says. And, you know, for comedic effect, it's kind of slightly amped up more than the actual experience. Similarly, you know, the situation with the choir is kind of a metaphor, I think, for what a lot of people experience in Iceland, which is wanting to kind of contribute or be involved, but finding it hard to do so for all sorts of reasons, and feeling maybe a bit alienated in that sense. And so, I'm just using creative methods that I have or tools that I have developed over time to reflect real things, but you know, fictionally. So that's kind of, I think, really fruitful. I found it very fruitful as a creative. I've found, you know, I haven't necessarily been writing more than I was because I simply haven't had the time, but I've had so many ideas and I've been able to I have published more in the last sort of year than I had previously. So perhaps it has been kind of generative of work for me, creative work, but also it does offer interesting ways of exploring research material. And I would say that a short story like that conveys at least as much as maybe an academic article might on the same subject, which, you know, whether that's, you know, migration or choirs or whatever. Like, you know, it's the way that you convey a sense of the real, whatever that might mean. I think this is what creative writing at least has in common with anthropology, is you're trying to capture something real, but anthropologists traditionally have tried to do that by sort of describing it in certain detail, but a creative writer might try to accomplish the same thing through even wildly fictional, you know, situations or circumstances, but the essence of the experience still speaks to something that's real, you know, whatever that might be, loneliness or isolation or alienation or choirs.
Yeah. It's a really wonderful short story, and you're completely right. I relate to it a lot, and I think a lot of people could talk about similar experiences. I'm wondering if you would be up for reading a short passage from it.
Sure. She's warned me not to stay out too late. Do you know, she says, for many years a major cause of death in Iceland was að vera úti, to be outside. She reminds me of this every morning when she decides my scarf is not thick enough or my gloves are too threadbare. As she pours herself a shot of brennivin in the kitchen each evening, she'll gladly tell me all the reasons I die in Iceland, without her forbearance, of course. I'm never in enough layers, or I'll crash my car on Icelandic roads. But I tell her it's probably winter depression that'll be the end of me. Ah, she nods. The key to surviving that is to keep the soul warm. And for that, she says, there are 5 simple tips. The first, exercise. Get out and move, she tells me. You mean where I might die, I ask? She laughs like I'm a silly child.
So this is an imagined conversation between you, perhaps, or some character and their Icelandic landlords.
Well, many people here tell me that I never wear enough layers and laugh at me, which is true because I'm often unprepared for the weather, an experience I think a lot of new migrants have. But yeah, I never had that conversation with the landlady that I actually had. I had that conversation with many other people, but you know, you can kind of bring this into a single character, a single experience to kind of explore the multitude kind of experience that I've had while I've been here. So
yeah, and I think that's really interesting how you're kind of doing that both through your fiction and through this way of, you know, that I hear you in terms of the potential pitfalls of this way of expressing the findings of your research as well through the personas, but it's interesting how they correlate and relate to one another.
Yeah, I think the pitfalls as well of writing fiction and it being fiction, but people presuming it not to be. And this, I think, is also true of fiction in general in Iceland, at least, or at least I've spoken with writers here who have said that anytime they publish a book, people spend a lot of time trying to figure out who the characters actually are, and that's fair enough. But sometimes, yeah, I mean, I don't know if it's necessarily a pitfall, but it can just be fiction.
It's a quirk of being here for sure. And I've also spoken to people who've sometimes experienced really negative fallout from situations like this, where there's, especially when a fictional story might be based on a real account or experience, unless you go really far in the past and take your basis of a story from something that's beyond living memory, then you can really experience challenges with trying to publish something that's got any expressed element of truth in it. So it doing research here, living here, doing creative work here comes with these particular quirks and idiosyncrasies of the small population and the harsh weather and all of these different things. I think you've captured really wonderfully in both your creative writing and your research and your general creative endeavours in community building as well, which is also integral to survival, if I would add a survival tip. To finish off, I would love if we could just get some kind of takeaways from this, especially relating this back to East of Moon and the work that we do in terms of innovation and communities and how we can bridge gaps between areas of learning and understanding and how these things can be applied. In terms of what you've found out and what you're still finding out, how do you think organisations like East of Moon or, we've already talked about kind of governments and so on being involved in social change, but in practical terms, what are some ways that we can embed research practices like this into our community practice or our work in general? And what would you like people to take away from the work that you're doing and take on in their thinking?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think I would talk a little about, in thinking about this, I would talk a little about Reykjavik Poetics as an example of a kind of a community organization that, well, actually, to go back a step, Osprasan, I mentioned before, a journal that kind of emerged from a group of women who were finding it difficult, not all of them migrants, but women who were finding it difficult to get published here in Iceland. And they wanted to write, they wanted to publish, and there was just nowhere for them to do that. And so they decided that they would create their own press and publish their own work, but also open it out to basically anyone who was having trouble getting published here in Iceland. And I think that began to create a space, among other things that were going on, began to create a space where people who were otherwise finding barriers or challenges to expressing themselves creatively or just in general suddenly had an opportunity to do this. And then you had Reykjavik Poetics that started up a year or two ago, which was supported by an institution, the Reykjavik UNESCO City of Literature, through funding, but again was a really kind of very much a grassroots kind of organization that emerged to, again, create a space for people to perform creative work that they were writing to whoever would want to come along in any language and really break down this idea of gatekeeping and barriers to this kind of activity. So all that, I think, is to say that, communities are really good at, when they need to, creating the spaces that they want to see. And we don't have to always helicopter in and plant these seeds. Actually, probably what's best is to figure out what people locally want and need and have those conversations and maybe give them the tools that they need to make that happen. As an anthropologist, I wouldn't necessarily do that, but as someone who's interested in creative communities and creative practices, that sort of strikes me as kind of a more sensible, the most sensible way of kind of encouraging communities to grow and foster these kind of creative connections is to kind of figure out what they're looking for and what they want, what they feel like they want, and exploring that with them and giving them those tools. So, yeah, I think for an organization like East of Moon and other similar organizations that are investing in the work that communities are doing, there's so much already that you guys are doing to kind of engage with those communities and find out what they want. And I think the research shows that this is, the community-led kind of approach is going to have the best outcome. I would always advocate for sort of, if possible, adding to the broader knowledge of how, these kind of projects emerge, what challenges are experienced, how those challenges might be overcome. Because I think this is a kind of in terms of the academic sector, this is a kind of a nascent new kind of area, and there's always so much that can be learned. But, having a researcher involved in every project is also quite difficult. But, trusting that communities know what they need and encouraging them to kind of have and really identifying those voices that are often kind of sidelined, I think is really important. And I think that's something that East of Moon does really well as well, is like finding the young voices or the, otherwise marginalized voices that can be the most creative and can be saying the most interesting things or doing the most interesting things because they've got nothing to lose, or they're kind of already on the outskirts. So these are the spaces and places where the most interesting stuff is often happening.
Well, I would agree. I think you get a lot of just much more genuine creativity a lot of the time out of these more liminal or constrained spaces that people interact and come at things from. So I think you have done a really wonderful job of illustrating that through your research, and I'm really looking forward to seeing the final result whenever that is available. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast, for being our first guest, Christopher, and we will put all of your links to your website and other bits and pieces down below. And will there be any more copies of Iceland in Other Words available at some point?
There's a couple left.
Okay.
We may be making a few more. We'll see how we go.
Yeah. Well, I would encourage everybody to get their hands on that as well. Thank you again.
Thank you.